The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones of Mayfair, each rotation bringing Maribel Hartwick closer to an evening she had contemplated avoiding altogether. Through the fogged window, she watched the grand townhouses pass by, their windows ablaze with candlelight, their facades decorated with winter greenery that spoke of wealth and celebration. The annual Winterbourne Ball was the pinnacle of the London season's December festivities, and declining an invitation would have been more scandalous than attending alone at 40 years of age. Her maid, Agnes, sat across from her in the cramped confines of the hired carriage, her weathered hands folded primly in her lap. The woman had served the Hartwick family for 3 decades and knew better than to offer empty reassurances. Instead, she simply met Maribel's gaze with steady understanding, the kind that came from witnessing every ball, every season, every gradual transformation from hopeful debutante to confirmed spinster. "The pearls suit you, miss," Agnes said finally, her voice carrying the weight of genuine affection rather than dutiful flattery. Maribel touched the strand at her throat, her mother's pearls, lustrous and perfect against the deep burgundy silk of her gown. She had chosen the colour deliberately, not the pale pastels expected of young ladies seeking husbands, but something richer, more dignified, a colour that announced she had made peace with her station, even if that peace was as fragile as spun sugar. "Thank you, Agnes." She managed a smile that felt almost genuine. "At least I shall look respectable while enduring their pity." The carriage lurched to a stop before the Winterbourne residence, a magnificent structure of Portland stone that dominated its corner of the square. Footmen in pristine livery descended the steps to assist arriving guests, their movements practiced and precise. Maribel waited her turn, watching as elegant couples emerged from their carriages, the ladies' jewels catching the light from the torches that lined the entrance. She was alone. She had always been alone at these affairs since her father's death 5 years prior. Her brother lived in the country with his growing family, content with his modest estate, and showing little interest in chaperoning his spinster sister through London's social labyrinth. Not that she blamed him. What man wanted to spend his evenings watching society's matrons whisper about his unmarried sister? The footman handed her down, and Maribel gathered her shawl more tightly against the December chill. The entrance hall blazed with light from 3 massive chandeliers, their crystals casting rainbow fragments across the marble floors. She surrendered her wrap to a waiting servant and paused before the gilt-edged mirror in the foyer, checking her appearance one final time. The woman who gazed back at her was handsome rather than beautiful. Her features had always been too strong for conventional prettiness. A determined chin, direct hazel eyes, a mouth that smiled less easily than it once had. But her figure remained trim, her posture impeccable, and her dark hair, though threaded with grey at the temples, was arranged in an elegant chignon that required no false additions. She looked exactly like what she was, a gentlewoman of good family and modest fortune, past the age of youthful bloom, but not yet resigned to the cap and shawl of elderly spinsterhood. She existed in that peculiar limbo reserved for women who had somehow failed to secure their futures, according to society's prescribed timeline. The receiving line moved with glacial slowness. Lady Winterbourne, resplendent in emerald silk and enough diamonds to ransom a small kingdom, greeted each guest with the same mechanical smile. When Maribel's turn came, the hostess's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, or might simply have been the exhaustion of standing for hours in uncomfortable shoes. "Miss Hartwick, how delightful to see you." The words were warm, but Lady Winterbourne's eyes had already moved to the next guest in line. "Do enjoy yourself this evening." And then Maribel was through, released into the glittering chaos of the ballroom beyond. The space was magnificent, 2 stories high with walls painted in cream and gold, the ceiling adorned with frescoes depicting classical scenes of pastoral romance. Banks of hothouse flowers filled every alcove, their perfume mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive cologne. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, their instruments creating a waterfall of sound that seemed to pull guests onto the dance floor like moths to flame. Maribel made her way to the periphery of the room, where the chairs lined the walls and the older guests congregated. This was her territory now, the realm of chaperones and dowagers, of those who watched rather than participated. She recognized several faces: Lady Pemberton with her notorious tongue for gossip, Mrs. Ashford, who had buried 3 husbands and seemed in no hurry to acquire a 4th, and the widow Chelmsford, whose fortune made her the target of every aging rake in London. "Maribel, darling?" The widow Chelmsford patted the empty chair beside her with a heavily ringed hand. "Come sit with me. These young things are making me feel positively ancient with their energetic dancing." Maribel accepted gratefully, settling into the chair with a relief she hoped wasn't too obvious. Margaret Chelmsford was one of the few women in society who treated her with genuine kindness rather than patronizing pity. Perhaps because Margaret had married late herself, wedding her elderly husband at 35, after spending years as a companion to a demanding aunt. "You look lovely this evening," Margaret continued, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Maribel's appearance. "That colour is magnificent on you, so much more interesting than these insipid pastels the girls are wearing." Maribel followed her gaze to the dance floor, where young ladies in white and pink and pale blue floated past, like so many flower petals. They were beautiful in their youth and optimism, and she felt no bitterness toward them. She had been one of them once, fresh from the schoolroom with dreams of romance and security. The fact that those dreams had withered on the vine was no one's fault but her own. "Too fastidious," her mother had said before she died. "You wait for perfection, Maribel, and perfection does not exist in mortal men." Perhaps that had been true in her first few seasons. She had declined several perfectly acceptable offers, believing herself entitled to choose love over convenience. But as the years passed and the offers dwindled, she had lowered her standards considerably. The problem was that by then, gentlemen had raised theirs. A woman of 25 might still attract interest. One of 35 did not, especially when her portion was modest and her connections unremarkable. The music shifted to a waltz, and Maribel watched the couples form up with practiced ease. The dance floor became a swirl of colour and movement, perfectly synchronized bodies moving in 3/4 time. She had loved to dance once. Her teachers had praised her natural grace, her instinctive understanding of the music. But it had been years since anyone had asked her to stand up with them, and she suspected her skills had grown as rusty as her romantic prospects. "Lady Pemberton is holding court," Margaret murmured, nodding toward a cluster of women near the refreshment table. No doubt dissecting every outfit and indiscretion within range. Maribel had learned to ignore Lady Pemberton's poisoned tongue, though it had taken practice. The woman delighted in cataloguing the failures of others, perhaps to distract from her own disappointments. Her daughters had all made adequate marriages, but none had ascended to the heights Lady Pemberton had envisioned for them. The evening progressed with predictable monotony. Maribel accepted a cup of punch from a passing footman, made polite conversation with Mrs. Ashford about the weather, and tried not to count the hours until she could reasonably depart. The ballroom grew warmer as more guests arrived, the air thick with the heat of so many bodies in close proximity. It was during the second hour, as the dancing reached its peak of enthusiasm, that Maribel heard the laughter. It came from behind her, sharp and cutting in a way that made the fine hairs on her neck rise in instinctive warning. She didn't turn immediately, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing she had heard. But the voices continued, young and careless and cruel in the way that only the very young could be. Poor thing, she comes to every ball as if someone might still ask her to dance. At her age, my dear, she should accept her fate gracefully and retire to the country like a proper spinster. Mamma says she had chances years ago but was too proud to accept them. Now look at her, sitting with the widows and dowagers. The laughter bubbled up again, and Maribel felt her spine stiffen against the chair. She had endured worse whispers, sharper barbs. But something about this night, about the casual cruelty delivered so close to the season, celebrating peace and goodwill, made her throat tighten with unwelcome emotion. Margaret's hand found hers beneath the folds of her skirt, squeezing gently in silent support. But even her friend's kindness couldn't erase the sting of being reduced to an object of mockery, a cautionary tale for ambitious mothers to share with their daughters. Still hoping for a proposal at 40, one of them continued, her voice carrying too well in a momentary lull of the music. How perfectly pathetic. Perhaps next winter, another added, and their laughter rang out like breaking glass. Maribel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She needed air, needed escape. Needed anywhere but here where she had to endure the casual destruction of what remained of her dignity. Margaret started to rise as well, but Maribel shook her head, managing a smile that felt like it might crack her face in two. "Just going to find the retiring room," she murmured, though they both knew it was a lie. She moved through the crowd with blind determination, not caring who she brushed past or what conversation she interrupted. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, the ones that led to the terrace and the garden beyond. If she could just reach them, just breathe air that didn't smell of roses and judgment. "Excuse me." The voice stopped her mid-step, deep and cultured, with the kind of authority that made people listen without conscious thought. Maribel turned, blinking away the moisture that had gathered in her eyes, and found herself face to face with a man she recognized but had never formally met. Theobald Ravenscar, Duke of Northwick. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet in his stockinged feet, with the kind of presence that drew eyes even in a room full of aristocrats. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, suggesting he was somewhere in his mid-40s, and his features were stern rather than handsome, a strong jaw, hawkish nose, and grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore his evening clothes with the casual elegance of a man who neither thought about nor cared for fashion, yet somehow managed to look more distinguished than every peacock in the room. "Your Grace." Maribel sank into a curtsy automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had fled. "Forgive me, I nearly collided with you. The fault was mine for standing in your path." His voice remained level, but something in his expression suggested he had witnessed the scene that had driven her from her seat. "Might I have the pleasure of this dance, Miss—" He trailed off expectantly, and Maribel realized with a start that he genuinely didn't know her name. They had never been introduced, despite attending many of the same events over the years. The Duke of Northwick was known for his reclusiveness, attending only the most obligatory social functions and leaving as soon as duty allowed. He never danced, never flirted, never showed the slightest interest in the marriage mart, despite being one of the most eligible bachelors in England. "Hartwick," she supplied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Maribel Hartwick." "Miss Hartwick." He inclined his head with old-fashioned courtesy. "Would you honor me with this waltz?" Behind them the cruel laughter had died into shocked silence. Maribel could feel dozens of eyes fixed on her back, could practically hear the frantic mental calculations as society's elite tried to comprehend why the Duke of Northwick was asking an aging spinster to dance. Her first instinct was to decline, to save them both the awkwardness of whatever charity had prompted this gesture. But something in his grey eyes stopped her. Not pity, which she would have rejected immediately, but a kind of fierce determination that suggested this invitation was about more than simple kindness. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she heard herself say. He extended his hand and she placed hers in it, feeling the warmth of his palm through both their gloves. The orchestra was indeed starting a waltz, the opening notes floating through the suddenly hushed ballroom. The Duke led her onto the floor with the same purposeful stride he might use entering Parliament, parting the crowd simply by existing. They took their positions, his hand settling at her waist, hers resting on his shoulder. And then the music swept them into motion, and Maribel discovered that her skills had not deserted her after all. Her body remembered the steps, the rhythm, the give and take required to move as one with a partner. The Duke was an excellent dancer, despite his reputation for avoiding the pastime, his movements sure and confident, without being showy. "Breathe," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "You're holding tension in your shoulders." She exhaled shakily, forcing her muscles to relax. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I am not accustomed to—" "Being rescued?" His mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile. "Neither am I accustomed to playing the knight-errant. We are both out of our element this evening." They turned, and Maribel caught a glimpse of the spectators, watching them with expressions ranging from shock to envy to naked speculation. The young women who had mocked her stood frozen near the refreshment table, their faces pale with dawning horror, as they realized the Duke must have overheard them. "They didn't mean—" Maribel started, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to defend them. "They meant every word," the Duke interrupted, his tone hardening. "Cruelty often masquerades as thoughtlessness, but that doesn't make it less cruel." The waltz carried them past Lady Pemberton, whose jaw had gone slack with astonishment, past Margaret Chelmsford, whose eyes shone with delighted approval, past the cluster of eligible young ladies who had spent the entire season hoping to catch the Duke's attention, only to watch him bestow it on the most unlikely candidate in the room. "Your Grace," Maribel said carefully, "I appreciate your kindness, but you need not feel obligated to. I never do anything out of obligation when it comes to matters of personal choice." His grey eyes fixed on hers with unsettling intensity. "I asked you to dance because I wished to dance with you. If that displeases the gossips, then they are welcome to their displeasure." The music swelled, and they moved through a series of turns that required concentration, preventing further conversation. Maribel found herself relaxing into the dance, despite the surreal nature of the situation. When had she last felt this? Not happy exactly, but present, engaged with the moment rather than simply enduring it. Too soon, the waltz ended. The final notes faded into applause that sounded oddly hesitant, as if the assembled guests weren't certain how to respond to what they had witnessed. The Duke kept her hand in his, making no move to return her to her seat. "The terrace," he said quietly. "I believe you were heading there before I intercepted you." Heat flooded Maribel's cheeks. He had noticed her flight, her distress, and chosen to intervene rather than pretend ignorance like everyone else. She should be mortified, but instead felt an unexpected gratitude that threatened to undo the careful composure she had maintained. "Yes," she admitted, "the air in here is rather close." He guided her toward the tall windows, their progress watched by every person in the ballroom. Footmen rushed to open the doors, and then they were through, stepping onto the stone terrace that overlooked the Winterbourne Gardens. The December air hit like a slap, cold and clean after the overheated ballroom. Maribel's breath emerged in silvery clouds as she moved to the balustrade, gripping the cold stone to ground herself. The garden stretched below them, winter bare and touched with frost that glittered in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, the Thames flowed dark and steady, and the sounds of London at night drifted up, carriage wheels, distant voices, the eternal pulse of the city that never truly slept. "I must apologize," the Duke said, coming to stand beside her. "I have put you in an awkward position." "You have saved me from one," Maribel corrected, then bit her lip, "though I suppose the gossip will be fierce regardless." "Gossip is the primary currency of the ton. They will spend it whether we give them cause or not." She glanced at him, trying to reconcile the stern, reserved man she had observed from afar with the person who now stood beside her in the moonlight. "Why did you ask me to dance, Your Grace? We have never even been formally introduced. Does one need a formal introduction to recognize injustice?" He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I have watched you, Miss Hartwick, at various functions over the past several seasons. You comport yourself with dignity in circumstances that would reduce lesser women to bitter spite. You show kindness to those who show you none, and you endure the casual cruelty of society with a grace that speaks to strength of character." Maribel's throat tightened. "You make me sound far more admirable than I am." "I doubt that." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I overheard what those young women said, and I found myself angry, which is unusual for me. I am not generally moved to emotion by the follies of society." "Then why?" "Because it reminded me of my sister." The words came out rougher than before, tinged with old pain. "Catherine was unmarried at 43 when she died. She spent her final years enduring exactly the kind of mockery you suffered tonight. I did nothing to defend her then, too concerned with my own affairs to notice her humiliation. I cannot undo that failing, but I can ensure it does not happen to another woman in my presence." The revelation hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that society rarely permitted. Maribel felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly, "and for her pain. As am I." He straightened, and some of the vulnerability left his expression, replaced by the ducal mask he wore like armor. "Which brings me to the reason I followed you out here, beyond simple enjoyment of the evening air." Maribel waited, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. The moonlight cast his face in sharp relief, all planes and shadows and stern determination. "Inside that ballroom," he continued, "there are at least 24 people who witnessed me dance with you. By morning, that number will become 200, and by week's end the entire ton will be speculating about my intentions. Your Grace—" He held up a hand, silencing her. Allow me to finish, if you please. I am 46 years old, Miss Hartwick. I have spent the last 20 years avoiding the marriage mart, like it was a plague ward. I have no interest in some simpering girl fresh from the schoolroom, no desire for children to carry on my name, and no patience for the games society expects one to play in courtship. Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that Maribel couldn't yet fully comprehend. What I do have, he said, his grey eyes holding hers with almost uncomfortable intensity, is respect for a woman who has shown remarkable dignity in the face of society's judgment, and a strong aversion to allowing the gossips inside that ballroom to turn our waltz into further ammunition against your reputation. The cold air stung Maribel's lungs as she tried to process what he was saying. I don't understand. Then, allow me to be perfectly clear. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that bracketed his mouth and spoke of years spent in serious contemplation. If I return you to that ballroom now, unmarried and unclaimed, they will tear you apart. They will whisper that even the Duke of Northwick found you wanting after a single dance. Your situation will be infinitely worse than it was before I intervened. Horror washed over Maribel as she realized he was right. She had been invisible before, easily ignored. Now she would be notorious, the woman who had briefly caught a duke's attention and failed to hold it. However, he continued, if I were to announce that our dance was not merely a kindness, but the first public appearance of my intended bride, the narrative changes entirely. You become the woman clever enough to capture England's most elusive bachelor, and those young women who mocked you become the fools who failed to recognize your worth. The world seemed to tilt beneath Maribel's feet. Your Grace, you cannot possibly be suggesting a marriage of convenience, he said bluntly, not a love match, which neither of us requires at our age, but a partnership based on mutual respect and practical considerations. You gain protection, status, and freedom from society's judgment. I gain a duchess capable of managing my social obligations without demanding romance or children I have no interest in providing. But surely you could— Maribel gestured helplessly toward the ballroom. There are dozens of suitable young women who would bore me to tears within a fortnight, he interrupted. Who would expect courtship and devotion and all the pretty lies that young people trade like currency? I have no patience for such things, Miss Hartwick, but I could respect a woman like you, and respect, I have found, is a far more stable foundation than passion. Maribel's mind reeled. An hour ago, she had been sitting with the widows and dowagers, contemplating another lonely year stretching before her. Now the Duke of Northwick was proposing marriage as casually as one might propose a business merger. This is madness, she whispered. Perhaps. He studied her face as if trying to memorize her features. Or perhaps it is the most rational decision either of us could make. You would want for nothing, have complete authority over household matters, and never again endure the humiliation you suffered tonight. I would have a capable duchess to manage my estates and social obligations, leaving me free to focus on Parliament and my business interests. Without love, Maribel said, though whether it was a question or a statement she wasn't certain. Without the illusion of love, he corrected. Most marriages in our circles lack even basic affection, yet the couples pretend otherwise for society's benefit. I'm offering you honesty instead, a partnership where we both understand the terms and expectations. The cold was seeping through Maribel's thin evening slippers, making her toes ache. Or perhaps that was simply the shock of the most surreal conversation she had ever experienced. In the ballroom behind them, music and laughter continued, the ball rolling forward without any awareness that her entire life was poised on the edge of transformation. I need time, she finally managed, to think, to consider. Of course. But something in his expression suggested disappointment, though it was quickly masked. Though I would ask that you consider carefully. The gossip begins tomorrow regardless of your decision. If you decline, you will face it alone. If you accept, he let the sentence hang, letting her imagination fill in the rest. If she accepted, she would become the Duchess of Northwick, one of the most powerful women in England. She would never again sit with the wallflowers, never again endure pitying glances or cruel laughter. She would have security, status, and the respect that came with being a duke's wife. And all it would cost was the dream of love she had long since given up anyway. How long do I have to decide? The words emerged steadier than she felt. The ball ends at midnight. He pulled a pocket watch from his waistcoat, checking the time by moonlight. It is now 11:30. If you agree, we will return to the ballroom together, and I will make the announcement before the guests depart. If you decline, I will escort you to your carriage with my thanks for an enjoyable dance, and we will not speak of this again. 30 minutes. He was giving her 30 minutes to decide the course of her entire future. Maribel turned back to the garden, her hands gripping the balustrade so tightly her knuckles showed white even through her gloves. Below, frost sparkled on winter roses that had somehow survived the season's first freeze. They looked fragile in the moonlight, but they had endured what should have destroyed them. Perhaps she could too. The roses below shimmered with frost, their fragile beauty a reminder that survival sometimes required accepting the cold. Maribel drew a shaky breath, watching it cloud in the December air. 30 minutes to decide her entire future. It seemed both impossibly short and unbearably long. Behind her the Duke remained silent, giving her the space to think without the pressure of his presence. She appreciated that restraint, that recognition that such a decision could not be rushed, despite the arbitrary deadline he had imposed. Of course, the deadline wasn't truly arbitrary. It was dictated by society's relentless appetite for scandal and the need to control the narrative before the gossips did. She thought of her small house in Bloomsbury, the one her father had left her along with a modest income. It was respectable but hardly grand, and she managed it herself with only Agnes and a cook to assist her. Her days were predictable. Charitable work on Tuesdays, correspondence on Wednesdays, the occasional tea with Margaret Chelmsford, or another of the few women who still sought her company. It was a quiet life, and she had told herself she was content with it. But was contentment the same as happiness? And did it matter when the alternative was this, a marriage of convenience to a man she didn't know, based on mutual respect and practical considerations rather than affection? The Duke had been honest about his intentions at least. He wanted a capable Duchess to manage his social obligations and estates while he focused on Parliament and business. He didn't want romance or children or the pretense of love that most society marriages required, even when the emotion was entirely absent. In its way, that honesty was refreshing. How many women married believing in love only to discover their husbands viewed them as little more than ornamental property? At least she would enter this arrangement with clear eyes and realistic expectations. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" She turned to find him watching her with that same inscrutable expression, his features carved from shadow and moonlight. "Of course. Why now? You said you've spent 20 years avoiding marriage. What changed tonight that made you suddenly willing to propose to a stranger?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might refuse to answer. But then he moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that suggested military training in his youth. "I told you about my sister," he said finally. "What I didn't mention is that she died 6 months ago. And in settling her affairs, I found journals, dozens of them spanning decades. She wrote about her life, her disappointments, her gradual acceptance that society viewed her as a failure simply because she never married." His voice remained steady, but Maribel heard the pain beneath it, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. In her final entries, she wrote that she regretted wasting so much of her life caring what others thought of her, that she wished she had been brave enough to live on her own terms rather than society's. He turned to look at Maribel directly. Reading those words, I realized I had failed her not once, but countless times. I never defended her, never used my position to shield her from the very cruelty you experienced tonight, and I cannot bring her back or give her the life she deserved. "But you can offer that life to someone else," Maribel finished softly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I am simply an aging duke who has finally realized that duty sometimes aligns with desire." A hint of something that might have been humor touched his expression. "I do need a duchess, Miss Hartwick. My estates require management. I have neither time nor inclination to provide. My social obligations go unfulfilled because I loathe the superficiality of the ton, and my family has been pressuring me for years to secure the succession, though I have made it clear I will not father children simply to satisfy their expectations." Then why marry at all? The question emerged more boldly than she intended. "If you don't want children, Surely a competent steward could manage your estates. A steward cannot serve as my hostess at political dinners, cannot navigate the social complexities that influence parliamentary votes, cannot provide the appearance of stability that certain business ventures require. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I am not a romantic man, Miss Hartwick, but neither am I a complete cynic. I believe marriage can be a partnership of equals, provided both parties enter it with honest expectations and mutual respect. That is what I am offering you. Maribel turned his words over in her mind, examining them from every angle like a jeweler appraising a stone for flaws. A partnership of equals. How many women of her acquaintance could claim such a thing in their marriages? Most were subordinate to their husbands in every way, financially, legally, socially. They existed to provide heirs, manage households, and reflect well upon their spouses. Their own desires and ambitions, if they had any, were secondary at best. But a duke's wife would have power of her own, authority over vast estates, influence in society, the ability to shape her days according to her own interests, rather than simply enduring them. She could expand her charitable work, support causes she believed in, even maintain her own separate pursuits, provided she fulfilled her obligations as Duchess. It would be a busy life, certainly more demanding than her current existence, but it would matter. She would matter. What of... She hesitated, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. Forgive my indelicacy, but marriage involves certain expectations. If you do not want children, does that mean... I would not force my attentions upon you, he said bluntly, apparently unbothered by the intimate nature of the question. We would maintain separate bedchambers, as most aristocratic couples do. Whether we ever share more than that would be entirely your decision. I am offering you a partnership, Miss Hartwick, not ownership of your person. The frankness of his answer should have shocked her, but instead she felt a strange relief. How many women entered marriage with no clear understanding of what would be expected of them, only to discover their bodies were no longer their own? At least he was being honest about that as well. And if I wanted, that is, if I eventually desired. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't quite bring herself to speak so plainly about physical intimacy with a man she had met less than an hour ago. Then we would discuss it as rational adults and proceed accordingly. His tone suggested he was discussing estate management rather than marital relations. I am not a monk, Miss Hartwick, but neither am I ruled by base appetites. I have managed perfectly well for 46 years without a wife in my bed. I suspect I can continue to manage. A laugh surprised her, bubbling up unexpectedly. The absurdity of the conversation, the clinical discussion of marriage's most intimate aspects on a moonlit terrace, while a ball continued inside. It was the strangest courtship she could possibly have imagined. If one could even call it a courtship, when it consisted of a single dance and a business proposal. The Duke's mouth quirked slightly, and she realized it was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. I have shocked you. You have surprised me, she corrected. I don't know what I expected, but not this level of candor. I find pretense exhausting. He checked his pocket watch again, the movement drawing her attention to his hands, strong and capable, the hands of a man who had likely learned swordplay and horsemanship, and all the other skills expected of aristocratic gentlemen. You have 20 minutes remaining, Miss Hartwick. Is there anything else you need to know before you decide? 20 minutes. Maribel looked back at the frost-touched garden, at the winter roses that had survived against all odds. She thought of her small house, her predictable days, the gradual narrowing of her world as she aged into invisibility. She thought of sitting with the dowagers and widows year after year, watching younger women dance and marry and build lives, while hers simply persisted. And she thought of walking back into that ballroom as the Duke of Northwick's intended bride, watching the faces of those who had mocked her transform from cruel amusement to shocked disbelief. It shouldn't matter. She should be above such petty vindication. But she was human, and she had endured years of humiliation with grace. Perhaps she was entitled to this one moment of triumph. If I agree, she said slowly, what would the engagement entail? Would you expect a long courtship, or... I would expect us to marry by special license within the month, he replied promptly. A long engagement would only prolong the gossip and speculation. Better to present society with a fait accompli and move forward. Within the month. 4 weeks to prepare for a completely different life. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange exhilaration, like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing she was about to jump. "My brother would need to be informed," she said, testing the reality of it. "And I would need to settle my affairs, close up my house. Your brother could stay at the house when he visits London, if you prefer, or we could sell it and invest the proceeds for your personal use. The choice would be yours." He spoke as if her agreement was already given, as if he knew which way she was leaning. "You would receive a generous allowance as my Duchess, entirely separate from household accounts. Your money to spend as you see fit, no accounting required. Financial independence. Another thing most wives could never claim. Maribel's modest income was sufficient for her needs, but it required careful management. The idea of never having to worry about expenses, of being able to support causes and people without counting every shilling. "And your family?" she asked. "Surely they will object to such a sudden engagement to someone they've never met. My family's opinions ceased to concern me when they hounded my sister about her unmarried state even as she lay dying." His voice turned cold with old anger. "They will accept you because they have no choice, and because once you are Duchess, crossing you would be crossing me. I protect what is mine, Miss Hartwick." What is mine? The phrase should have bothered her, should have sounded possessive. But the way he said it suggested protection rather than ownership, a commitment to defend rather than control. And wasn't that what she had lacked all these years? Someone who would stand between her and society's casual cruelties, who would use their position and power to shield rather than expose her. The music from the ballroom swelled, another waltz beginning. How many couples were dancing now? Young men and women who took for granted the simple pleasure of being wanted. She had stopped taking it for granted years ago, had stopped expecting anything beyond polite tolerance from society. But this unexpected offer from an unlikely source, felt like a door opening in a wall she had thought solid. Beyond it lay uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. A different life than the one she had resigned herself to. Perhaps not the romantic dream of her youth, but something potentially better. A partnership built on honesty and respect. "Miss Hartwick," the Duke's voice pulled her from her reverie. "I require an answer." She turned to face him fully, this stern, reserved man who had witnessed her humiliation and chosen to intervene, who had offered her not love, but something perhaps more valuable, dignity, security, and the freedom to shape her own future within the framework of their arrangement. "I have conditions," she heard herself say. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Name them." "I want to continue my charitable work. I currently serve on the board of a foundling hospital and volunteer at a women's shelter. As your Duchess, I would expand those efforts, not abandon them." "Agreed. Such work would reflect well on the duchy and is entirely appropriate for a woman of your station. I want authority over all household matters without interference. If I am to manage your estates, I must have the freedom to make decisions without requiring your approval at every turn." "I would expect nothing less. I have neither time nor interest in domestic details. That would be your domain entirely." "And I want—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "I want us to be honest with each other. No pretense, no games. If this arrangement ceases to suit either of us, we should be able to discuss it openly." A reasonable request. He studied her face in the moonlight. "Do I take it these conditions indicate your acceptance?" Maribel's heart hammered against her ribs. This was insane. She was agreeing to marry a man she had known for less than an hour, based on a single dance and a frank conversation. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she needed more time, more information, more certainty. But when had certainty ever been possible in life? And what was she really risking? Her quiet, narrow existence in Bloomsbury? Her carefully maintained dignity as she aged into irrelevance? At 40 years old, she had little to lose and potentially everything to gain. "Yes," she said, the word emerging steady and clear. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but a subtle relaxation of tension she hadn't noticed until it eased. "Theobald," he said, If we are to be married, you should use my name, at least in private. Theobald, she repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. Then you must call me Maribel. Maribel. He said her name carefully, as if committing it to memory. Then he extended his hand and she placed hers in it, feeling the warmth even through both their gloves. Shall we return to the ballroom? I believe we have an announcement to make. The full weight of what she had agreed to suddenly crashed over her. In moments, she would walk back into that glittering assembly as the Duke of Northwick's intended bride. The gossip would be immediate and relentless. Her life would change irrevocably, publicly, with no possibility of retreat. Theobald must have sensed her momentary panic because his hand tightened slightly on hers. We can wait until tomorrow if you prefer. Make the announcement more privately, through the papers. No? Maribel straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of dignity she possessed. Those women mocked me less than an hour ago. Let them see exactly how wrong they were. A flash of approval crossed his features. As you wish. They walked back toward the ballroom together, his hand still holding hers in a gesture that would be noticed and remarked upon by everyone who saw them. The footman opened the doors, and warm air rushed out to meet them, carrying with it the scent of flowers and perfume, and the subtle musk of too many people in too small a space. The music faltered as they entered, dancers stumbling slightly, as attention shifted from the orchestra to the Duke and his companion. Conversations died mid-sentence, fans stilled in mid-flutter, every eye in the ballroom fixed on them with an intensity that would have been comical if it weren't so unnerving. Theobald led her directly to where Lady Winterbourne stood with her husband, the crowd parting before them, like water before a ship's prow. The Duke's presence commanded respect in a way that needed no announcement, no introduction. He simply was, and people responded accordingly. Your Grace. Lady Winterbourne dropped into a deep curtsy, her surprise evident. We are honoured by your continued presence. Lady Winterbourne, Lord Winterbourne. Theobald inclined his head with ducal courtesy. I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a moment. I have an announcement I wish to make before your guests depart. Of course, Your Grace. Anything. Lady Winterbourne's eyes darted between them, her mind clearly racing to comprehend what was happening. Lord Winterbourne, a portly man with kind eyes and political ambitions, gestured to the orchestra. Silence, if you please. His Grace the Duke of Northwick wishes to address the company. The music stopped. The remaining conversations sputtered into nothing. The ballroom fell silent, except for the rustle of fabric and the soft hiss of candle flames. Hundreds of people watched and waited, their faces reflecting curiosity, confusion, and in some cases, dawning comprehension. Maribel forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain her composure even as her legs trembled beneath her skirts. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. No retreat, no reconsideration. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her head held high. Theobald's voice when he spoke carried easily through the vast space. Years of addressing Parliament had taught him projection and authority, and he used both now. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your evening's entertainment. However, I find myself in possession of news too joyful to delay. He paused, letting the tension build, and Maribel realized he understood theatre even if he claimed to disdain it. It is my profound honor to announce my engagement to Miss Maribel Hartwick. We shall be married by special license before year's end. The silence stretched for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then the ballroom exploded into noise. Shocked gasps, delighted squeals from some quarters, dismayed protests from others. The sound rolled over them like a physical wave, and Maribel swayed slightly before steadying herself. She had expected reaction, but the sheer volume of it was overwhelming. Lady Winterbourne recovered first, her hostess instincts overriding her astonishment. Your Grace, Miss Hartwick, how absolutely wonderful. She moved forward to kiss Maribel's cheek, the gesture as much social calculation as genuine warmth. To show favour to the future Duchess of Northwick was to secure advantage. We are delighted to have hosted such a momentous occasion. Others surged forward then, the boldest and most ambitious leading the way. Congratulations flowed like wine, effusive and insincere in equal measure. The same people who had ignored Maribel an hour ago now pressed close, desperate to claim acquaintance with the Duke's intended bride. Through it all, Theobald remained at her side, his hand on her elbow, a small touch but one that anchored her to reality. She smiled and thanked people whose names she barely knew, accepted kisses from women who had never invited her to tea, and endured the scrutiny of hundreds of pairs of eyes dissecting every aspect of her appearance and manner. And then she saw them. The three young women who had mocked her stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, their faces pale with horror. One of them, Miss Cynthia Barrington, daughter of a baron with ambitions above his rank, looked as though she might faint. They had been caught in their cruelty, exposed before the entire ton, and they knew it. Maribel met Miss Barrington's eyes across the crowd and saw the moment the young woman realized she had been heard that the Duke's intervention had been a direct response to their mockery. To her credit, Miss Barrington looked genuinely mortified rather than merely embarrassed at being caught. Theobald followed Maribel's gaze, and his expression hardened. "Excuse me a moment," he murmured, then moved toward the young women with purposeful strides. The crowd parted for him instinctively, and Maribel watched as he stopped directly before the three who had laughed at her expense. His voice, when he spoke, was low enough that only those immediately nearby could hear, but his posture radiated cold fury. "Ladies," the word dripped with irony, "I trust you will extend your congratulations to my intended bride. After all, you expressed such interest in her marital prospects earlier this evening." Miss Barrington's face went from pale to crimson. "Your Grace, you didn't think anyone of consequence was listening." Theobald's tone could have frozen the Thames. "Let me assure you that I heard every word, and I will remember them, as will everyone else once word of this evening spreads. Please, Your Grace." Miss Barrington's voice trembled on the edge of tears. "We meant no real harm. You meant exactly the harm you caused. The only difference is that you have been caught in it." He stepped closer, his height and presence overwhelming. "I suggest you learn discretion, Miss Barrington, before your tongue costs you more than you can afford to lose. Not everyone will be as forgiving as my betrothed." He turned on his heel and returned to Maribel's side, leaving the three young women standing in mortified silence. The crowd had heard enough to understand what had transpired, and Maribel could see the speculation spreading like wildfire through knowing glances and whispered exchanges. By morning, the entire ton would know not only that the Duke of Northwick had become engaged, but that he had publicly humiliated three young women for mocking his intended bride. The story would be embellished and exaggerated with each retelling, but the core truth would remain. Cross the new Duchess of Northwick at your peril. "That was unnecessary," Maribel murmured as he rejoined her, though privately she felt a fierce satisfaction. "It was entirely necessary," he countered. "You are under my protection now, that means something." Margaret Chelmsford pushed through the crowd then, her face alight with joy that seemed entirely genuine. "Maribel, my dear girl." She embraced her warmly, then pulled back to study her face. "You sly thing, never breathing a word of this to me." "It happened rather suddenly," Maribel admitted, which was perhaps the most accurate understatement of her life. "Suddenly? You've known the Duke for—" Margaret paused, clearly doing mental calculations, and her eyes widened. Oh my. You've only just met, haven't you?" "This evening," Maribel confirmed quietly. Margaret's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Well then. That's quite remarkable." She glanced at Theobald with new respect. "Your Grace clearly recognizes quality when he sees it." "I do," Theobald said simply. "Which is why I intend to marry Miss Hartwick with all possible speed before some other gentleman realizes what a treasure she is." The compliment, delivered in his usual matter-of-fact tone, somehow felt more genuine than flowery protestations of love would have. Maribel felt warmth spread through her chest, something that might have been the first stirrings of affection for this strange, reserved man who had upended her life in a single evening. The crowd continued to press close, everyone wanting to claim a moment with the newly engaged couple. Lord Pemberton, a senior member of Parliament, engaged Theobald in a discussion of upcoming legislation that seemed to bore the Duke intensely, but which he tolerated with ducal forbearance. Several young ladies who had previously ignored Maribel now sought her out, clearly hoping to secure invitations to the wedding or future social events. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and utterly unlike anything Maribel had experienced in her 40 years. She had been invisible for so long that this sudden flood of attention felt surreal, as though she had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. Tired. Theobald appeared at her elbow, having somehow extricated himself from Lord Pemberton's monologue. Overwhelmed, she admitted. Shall we depart? I believe we have satisfied society's curiosity for one evening. The relief that washed over her must have shown on her face, because his expression softened slightly. Come, my carriage is far more comfortable than whatever conveyance brought you here. He offered his arm, and she took it gratefully. They made their farewells to Lord and Lady Winterbourne, who were still beaming with the reflected glory of having hosted such a momentous announcement. Then they were moving through the crowd again, this time toward the exit, leaving a wake of whispers and speculation behind them. The night air felt glorious after the stifling ballroom, cold and clean and blessedly empty of people. Theobald's carriage waited at the curb, a magnificent affair with the ducal crest emblazoned on the door, and a team of matched greys standing patient in their traces. A footman handed her up, and she sank into velvet cushions so soft they felt like sitting on a cloud. Theobald settled across from her, and the carriage lurched into motion, carrying them away from the Winterbourne residence and into the London night. You handled that well, he said after a moment. The attention, the sudden scrutiny, not everyone could manage it with such grace. I'm not certain grace is the right word, more like numb shock. Perhaps, but you didn't falter, didn't show weakness. That matters in our circles. Maribel leaned her head back against the cushions, suddenly exhausted. What have I done? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Secured your future, escaped a life of gradual decline into invisibility, chosen partnership over lonely dignity. His voice remained even, but something in his tone suggested he understood her uncertainty. Or if you prefer, accepted a business proposition from a man who needs a duchess and found you admirably suited to the role. And if I regret it tomorrow, then we will discuss it as the rational adults we claim to be. He was quiet for a moment, then added, For what it's worth, I do not believe you will regret it. You are too practical to have agreed without consideration, despite the limited time I allowed. The carriage rolled through Mayfair's quiet streets, passing darkened townhouses and the occasional late-night wanderer. Maribel watched the city slide past and wondered at the strangeness of her life. This morning she had woken as Miss Hartwick, aging spinster of modest means and no prospects. Tonight she would sleep as Miss Hartwick, betrothed to a duke and destined for a life she had never imagined possible. Where are we going? She asked suddenly, realizing she had never provided direction. To deliver you safely home, of course, your direction. Bloomsbury, Hart Street. If he found her address surprisingly modest for his future duchess, he gave no sign. Instead, he simply relayed the information to the driver through a small speaking tube, and the carriage altered its course. They rode in comfortable silence, and Maribel found herself studying her future husband in the dim light that filtered through the carriage windows. He was handsome in a severe way, all strong features and aristocratic bearing. Not the kind of man who would ever be called pretty or charming, but striking nonetheless. And there was something compelling about his directness, his refusal to engage in the social games that consumed most of their world. She could do worse. She had almost certainly done worse by doing nothing for 20 years. The carriage stopped before her modest townhouse, and a footman opened the door. Theobald descended first, then handed her down with old-fashioned courtesy. I will call on you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, he said. We have much to discuss regarding the wedding arrangements. Tomorrow, Maribel repeated, the reality of it settling over her like a cloak. Yes, of course. And Maribel? He still held her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that might have been unconscious. You made the right choice. I give you my word that I will never give you cause to regret it. Then he released her hand, bowed with perfect formality, and returned to his carriage. She stood on her steps and watched until the vehicle disappeared around the corner, taking with it her last chance to pretend this evening had been anything resembling normal. Agnes opened the door, her weathered face creased with concern. Miss, is everything all right? You're home so early. Maribel stepped inside, began to remove her gloves, then stopped and looked at her maid, her friend, really, after 30 years together. "Agnes," she said, hearing the wonder in her own voice, "I'm getting married." And as the older woman's face transformed from concern to shock to delight, Maribel Hartwick realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The morning arrived with brutal efficiency, sunlight streaming through Maribel's bedroom curtains, as if determined to expose every corner of the previous evening's unreality. She lay still for several moments, staring at the familiar ceiling plasterwork, and half convinced she had dreamed the entire affair. The ball, the mockery, the Duke's intervention, surely none of it had actually happened. Then Agnes knocked and entered with her morning chocolate, her face still wearing the delighted expression she had maintained since Maribel's announcement the night before. "Good morning, Your Grace-to-be." The maid's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Though I suppose I should practice saying Your Grace properly, hadn't I?" "Please don't," Maribel groaned, sitting up and accepting the cup gratefully. "Not yet. I'm barely reconciled to Miss Hartwick at the moment." Agnes settled at the foot of the bed with the familiarity of long service and genuine affection. "Tell me everything again. I was so shocked last night I barely took it in. You went to the ball, and the Duke of Northwick proposed. Just like that?" "Not exactly like that." Maribel sipped her chocolate, organizing her thoughts. There were extenuating circumstances. Some young women said unkind things, and His Grace overheard them. He asked me to dance, and then afterward, on the terrace, he made a proposal based on practical considerations. "Practical considerations?" Agnes's eyebrows climbed toward her cap. "What kind of romance is that?" "The kind that suits a woman of 40 and a man of 46. Maribel set down her cup, meeting her maid's eyes seriously. "He doesn't want love, Agnes. He wants a capable duchess who can manage his social obligations and estates, and I want security, respect, and the freedom to live without society's judgment. It's a business arrangement." "Business?" Agnes snorted softly. "Miss Maribel, I've served this family long enough to know that marriages built on less have flourished into genuine affection. Your own parents barely knew each other before their wedding, and they were devoted for 30 years. That was different. Was it? Or are you simply afraid to hope for more than you've bargained for?" The words hit uncomfortably close to truth. Maribel had spent so many years protecting herself from disappointment that hope felt dangerous, like inviting heartbreak with open arms. Better to expect nothing beyond the practical benefits of the arrangement and be pleasantly surprised if anything more developed. "He's calling at 2 o'clock, she said, changing the subject. "We need to discuss wedding arrangements. What does one wear to plan one's own convenience marriage? Something that makes you look like the duchess you're about to become." Agnes rose with purpose. "The burgundy day dress, I think. The one with the Belgian lace at the collar. And we'll do your hair in that braided coronet that makes you look regal." "Agnes, I'm hardly—" "You're about to become one of the highest-ranking women in England," Agnes interrupted firmly. "It's time you started looking the part." By the time 2 o'clock approached, Maribel had been dressed, coiffed, and positioned in the small drawing room with all the care of a general preparing for battle. The burgundy dress did suit her, lending warmth to her complexion and dignity to her bearing. The braided coronet made her look older, but in a stately way rather than simply aged. She had just finished arranging teacups on the tray when the knock came. Agnes showed the Duke in, her curtsy so deep it was almost comical, and then discreetly withdrew. Theobald filled the modest drawing-room with his presence, making the space seem suddenly cramped. He was dressed for daytime calls in dark grey wool and an immaculately tied cravat, looking every inch the aristocrat visiting a social inferior. Except his eyes, when they met hers, held no condescension, only a kind of searching assessment, as if checking that she hadn't vanished overnight like morning mist. "Miss Hartwick," he bowed with perfect formality, "I trust you slept well." As well as could be expected after such an evening. She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Please sit. Would you care for tea?" "Thank you." They observed the rituals of polite society, tea poured, pleasantries exchanged, the weather discussed with profound unimportance. But beneath the surface conventions, tension hummed like a plucked string. They were strangers preparing to bind their lives together, and no amount of Earl Grey could disguise that fundamental strangeness. Finally, Theobald set down his cup with quiet finality. "I have obtained a special license, We can marry as soon as you are prepared. I thought perhaps a week from today at my estate in Surrey. A small ceremony, immediate family only, if that suits you. A week. 7 days to prepare for marriage. Most women had months to ready themselves, to adjust to the idea of becoming a wife. But then most women weren't 40 years old and marrying for practical considerations rather than love. That suits me well enough, Maribel said, proud that her voice remained steady. My brother should be able to travel from Hertfordshire by then, and I have few other family members who would need to attend. The same for me. Most of my relatives will be annoyed at missing the social event of the season, but their disappointment doesn't concern me. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. I've had my solicitor draw up a marriage settlement. I want you to review it with your own legal counsel before signing. Maribel accepted the documents, surprised. Most men wouldn't. I'm not most men, and you should know exactly what you're agreeing to. He leaned forward, his expression intent. The settlement provides you with an annual income of £5,000 for personal use, independent of household accounts. In the event of my death, you'll receive the dower house on the Surrey estate, plus £10,000 per annum for life. Should you predecease me without children, your personal property returns to your family rather than my estate. The sums made her dizzy. £5,000 annually was more than her current total worth. And the provision about her property, most husbands claimed everything their wives owned upon marriage. The fact that he was protecting her interests spoke to an integrity she hadn't expected. This is very generous. It's fair. I'm asking you to upend your entire life and take on significant responsibilities. You should be compensated accordingly. He pulled out another document. This is a list of the primary estates and properties you'll oversee as Duchess. The Surrey estate is the family seat. Northwick Hall, approximately 5,000 acres. There's also a smaller property in Kent, the London townhouse, and a hunting lodge in Scotland that I rarely use. Maribel scanned the list, her head spinning. She had managed her modest household for 5 years, but this was a different order of magnitude entirely. Multiple estates, dozens of staff, social obligations that would fill every day. It was daunting and terrifying and oddly exhilarating all at once. I'll need to visit each property, she said, thinking aloud. Meet with the staff, review the current management systems. And I'll need detailed accounts for the past several years to understand the baseline operations. Theobald's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. My steward can provide everything you require. And I should mention, the Surrey estate has been somewhat neglected in recent years. My sister lived there until her death, but she was ill for some time and unable to properly oversee things. You'll likely find areas requiring significant attention. I see. Maribel set the papers aside, meeting his gaze directly. Your Grace, Theobald, I must be honest. I've managed a small household in Bloomsbury, not vast estates. I may not be as immediately competent as you expect. I expect you to learn to ask questions when uncertain and to make decisions to the best of your ability. That's all anyone can do. He paused, then added more quietly, My sister Catherine would have been an excellent duchess had she been given the chance. She had a keen mind for management and a genuine care for the people in her charge. I saw that in you last night, the same quality of steady competence and quiet strength. Trust yourself, Maribel. The use of her given name, the confidence in his voice, the unexpected invocation of his sister, it all combined to create a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. This man barely knew her, yet he was placing enormous trust in her hands. I'll do my best not to disappoint you. I don't believe you could if you tried. He stood, and she rose with him. I'll send my carriage for you tomorrow at 10. We should visit Northwick Hall so you can see what you're taking on. And I'd like to introduce you to the senior staff before the wedding. Tomorrow? She had imagined having a few days to adjust, to prepare mentally for the magnitude of change ahead. Is that too soon? He studied her face. I can delay if you need more time. No, Maribel said, surprising herself. No, tomorrow is fine. Better to face it directly rather than spend days worrying. That's what I thought. A hint of warmth entered his expression, not quite a smile, but close. You're more resilient than you credit yourself for, Maribel. I think you'll thrive in this role. After he left, Maribel sat in the sudden silence of her drawing room and tried to absorb the reality of what was happening. In 1 week, she would become the Duchess of Northwick. This house, her refuge for 5 years, would no longer be her primary residence. Her days of quiet anonymity were over, replaced by social obligations and estate management and a visibility she had never sought. The knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Agnes appeared with an apologetic expression and an armful of packages. "These just arrived, miss, from various shops in Bond Street, all addressed to you." Maribel opened the first package to find a stunning evening gown in midnight blue silk, accompanied by a note in bold handwriting, for the announcement dinner at Northwick Hall. Tea. The second package contained kid gloves in 3 different colours. The third held a cashmere shawl so fine it could be pulled through a wedding ring. The 4th, 5th and 6th revealed day dresses, morning gowns, and a riding habit in a deep forest green that made her breath catch. "He's clothing you like a duchess already," Agnes observed, examining the midnight blue gown with professional appreciation. "These are from Madame Rousseau's establishment, the most exclusive modiste in London." "It's too much." Maribel touched the silk with trembling fingers. "I have perfectly adequate clothing." "Adequate isn't the same as appropriate." Agnes fixed her with a knowing look. "He's preparing you for your new role, miss. Let him. It's not charity, it's investment in his own future. You'll be representing his family after all." The practical argument made sense, even if accepting such largesse felt uncomfortable. Maribel had been independent for so long, managing on her modest income and taking pride in her self-sufficiency. Now she would be dependent on Theobald's wealth, his position, his goodwill. The shift in power dynamics unsettled her, even as she acknowledged its inevitability. The week that followed passed in a blur of activity that left little time for doubt or reflection. The trip to Northwick Hall revealed an estate of breathtaking beauty, rolling parkland, ancient oaks, and a Palladian mansion that seemed to grow organically from the Surrey countryside. The house itself was magnificent, but showed signs of neglect in the details. Faded draperies, scuffed floors, gardens grown slightly wild. Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, was a formidable woman in her 60s who had served the family for 40 years. She welcomed Maribel with polite reserve that warmed considerably when Maribel spent 3 hours touring every corner of the house, asking detailed questions about operations, staff needs, and deferred maintenance. "The late Miss Catherine would approve of you," Mrs. Hendricks said finally, her stern features softening. "She always said Northwick Hall needed a proper mistress again. His Grace is a good man, but he's no hand for domestic management." Meeting the staff, reviewing the accounts, beginning to understand the scope of her future responsibilities, it was overwhelming and exhausting, and strangely satisfying. Maribel had spent years with too little to occupy her time and talents. Now she had perhaps too much, but the challenge appealed to something fundamental in her nature. Theobald himself proved an attentive if reserved companion during these preparatory days. He showed her the estate, introduced her to tenant farmers and local gentry, and answered her endless questions with patient thoroughness. But he maintained a careful distance, never touching her beyond the social necessities of helping her from carriages or offering his arm. It was as if he were determined to prove that their arrangement was exactly what he had promised, a partnership, not a romance. Maribel told herself she appreciated that restraint. She had agreed to a marriage of convenience, after all. Expecting more would be foolish. Yet sometimes when she caught him watching her with an expression of quiet contemplation, she wondered what thoughts moved behind those grey eyes. The announcement dinner 2 nights before the wedding was her first true test as the future Duchess. Theobald had invited a select group of influential guests, senior members of Parliament, a cabinet minister, several prominent aristocrats and their wives. It was a political gathering as much as a social one, and Maribel understood that her performance would be scrutinized carefully. She wore the midnight blue gown he had sent, and Agnes had outdone herself with an elegant arrangement of Maribel's hair that incorporated a strand of pearls woven through the dark tresses. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not young, certainly. The lines at her eyes and mouth remained evidence of 40 years lived, but dignified, regal. The woman reflected back at her looked capable of being a duchess. The evening proceeded with the formal precision of a military operation. Maribel greeted guests at Theobald's side, accepted their congratulations with gracious composure, and guided conversation through the dinner with a skill she hadn't known she possessed. Years of observing from the periphery of society had taught her more than she realized about social navigation. Lord Ashworth, the Home Secretary, engaged her in a discussion of prison reform that revealed he had actually read the report she had helped prepare for the Foundling Hospital Board. Lady Ashworth asked intelligent questions about Maribel's plans for the estate's home farm. The evening unfolded with a smoothness that felt almost choreographed, except none of it was false or forced. These people were treating her as an equal because she was about to become one. After the guests departed, Theobald found her in the library, where she had retreated for a moment of quiet. He carried 2 glasses of brandy and offered her one without asking if she wanted it. "Oh, you were magnificent tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Lord Ashworth asked if I would consider lending you to his wife's committee for workhouse reform." "Did he?" Maribel sipped the brandy, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "I would be interested in that work. I told him you would make your own decisions about which causes to support, that your time was your own to allocate as you saw fit." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "You surprised them, I think. They expected someone more conventional, less formidable." "Formidable," she laughed, the sound slightly brittle. "I spent most of the evening terrified of making some terrible mistake. Fear and competence aren't mutually exclusive. Catherine taught me that." His expression grew distant. "She was terrified of almost everything. Social gatherings, meeting new people, being judged and found wanting. But she managed our charitable foundations brilliantly and ran this estate with more skill than I could ever muster. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's functioning despite it." The conversation hung suspended between them, intimate in a way their previous interactions had not been. Maribel wondered if the brandy had loosened his usual reserve, or if the approaching wedding had made him feel he could show her more of his authentic self. "Why did you never marry?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "You're a duke, wealthy, not unappealing in appearance. Surely you had opportunities." "Countless opportunities," he agreed wryly. "But I watched my father's marriage, cold, transactional, both parties miserable but trapped by duty and convention. I swore I wouldn't replicate that unless I found someone I could genuinely respect and enjoy. And in 20 years of looking, I never did, until last week." The confession settled over her like a cloak, warm and heavy with implication. "You barely know me," she protested weakly. "I know enough." He set down his glass, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I know you endure hardship with grace. I know you're capable and intelligent and kind. I know you're honest enough to agree to a convenience marriage without pretending it's something else. That's more than most couples have on their wedding day. And if we grow to dislike each other, if proximity breeds contempt rather than affection, then we will manage it like adults with separate wings of the house and minimal interaction." His tone suggested he didn't actually believe that would happen. "But I don't think we will. I think we'll surprise ourselves, Maribel. I think this strange beginning might lead somewhere neither of us expected." She wanted to protest, to remind him that expectations led to disappointment. But something in his expression stopped her, a tentative hope that mirrored her own secret wondering. What if this impossible arrangement became something more? What if practical considerations transformed into genuine partnership, and partnership into something deeper still? "We shall see," she said finally, which was as much as she could commit to with 2 days remaining until their wedding. The ceremony itself was exactly what Theobald had promised. Small, private, and mercifully brief. They married in the chapel at Northwick Hall, with only Maribel's brother Thomas and his wife in attendance, along with Theobald's elderly uncle and a handful of essential servants serving as witnesses. The vicar spoke the traditional words, his voice echoing in the ancient space. Maribel repeated her vows in a steady voice, feeling the weight of each promise settle onto her shoulders like a mantle, to love, honor, and obey until death parted them. She had never expected to speak these words, had long since resigned herself to spinsterhood. Now here she stood in a gown of cream silk and Brussels lace, becoming a duchess at 40 years old. Theobald's voice, when he made his vows, was deep and serious, each word deliberate as if he were signing a legal document, which in essence he was. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, he turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Satisfaction, relief, and something that might have been tenderness. "May I kiss you, Maribel?" The question was asked quietly, meant only for her ears. The fact that he asked rather than simply taking the privilege their marriage now granted him made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Yes. His lips brushed hers, gentle and brief, and surprisingly warm. A chaste kiss, the kind exchanged by elderly relatives, yet somehow it felt significant, binding, the seal on a contract neither of them fully understood yet. The wedding breakfast afterward was equally modest, champagne and cake and toasts from Thomas that grew increasingly emotional as he contemplated his sister's sudden elevation. Thomas had always been a kind brother, if an absent one, and Maribel could see he was genuinely pleased for her good fortune, even if he didn't quite comprehend how it had happened. "I still can't believe it," he said, pulling her aside during the celebration. 3 weeks ago you were living quietly in Bloomsbury, and now you're a duchess. It's like something from a novel." "It feels rather like that from my perspective as well," Maribel admitted. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover it was all a dream. But it's not, Bella. You're actually married to the Duke of Northwick." Thomas shook his head in wonder, using the childhood nickname he hadn't employed in years. "Promise me you'll be happy, or at least content. You deserve that much after everything." "I promise to try," she said, which was honest if not particularly reassuring. By evening the guests had departed, and Maribel found herself alone in the Duchess's suite, a series of rooms that connected to the Duke's chambers through a door that currently stood closed. She had expected nervousness about the wedding night, but Theobald had made his intentions clear. Separate bedrooms, no expectations of intimacy. They were married in law and name, but the relationship beyond that would develop at its own pace. Still, when the knock came at the connecting door, her heart jumped into her throat. "Enter," she called, grateful her voice didn't shake. Theobald appeared still dressed in his wedding attire, though he had removed his jacket and loosened his cravat. The informality made him look younger, more approachable. "I wanted to check that you had everything you needed," he said. "Mrs. Hendricks has assigned you a lady's maid, Clara, the young woman with red hair. She's competent and discreet." "Yes, I've met her. She's lovely." Maribel gestured to one of the chairs by the fireplace, and he settled into it with the weary relief of a man who had endured a long day. "Thank you for the consideration. This is your home now. I want you to be comfortable here." He studied the flames crackling in the hearth. "I know this is all very strange. A fortnight ago we were strangers, and now we're legally bound for life. If you need time to adjust, to find your footing—" "I'm adjusting as we speak," Maribel interrupted gently, "and I appreciate your patience. Not every man would be so considerate. Most men are fools where women are concerned. They mistake ownership for partnership and wonder why their wives despise them." He looked up, his grey eyes catching the firelight. "I don't want your resentment, Maribel. I want your respect, and hopefully, in time, your friendship." Friendship. It was such a modest goal for a marriage, yet somehow it felt more honest than the flowery protestations of eternal devotion that characterized most wedding vows. Friends respected each other, supported each other, enjoyed each other's company without the poisonous expectations that often destroyed romantic love. "I think we could be friends," she said slowly. "In fact, I suspect we already are, somewhat." "Good." He rose, preparing to depart. "Then I'll leave you to rest. Tomorrow the real work begins. You have estate business to learn and staff to organize, but tonight sleep well. You've earned it, Your Grace." The title sounded strange in his voice, formal yet tinged with something that might have been affection. Maribel stood as well, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the firelit room. Two people who had married as strangers and were now beginning the long process of becoming something more. "Good night, Theobald." "Good night, Maribel." He withdrew through the connecting door, pulling it closed behind him with a soft click. And Maribel stood alone in her new chambers, a duchess at last, feeling not the triumph she had expected, but rather a quiet sense of possibility. This strange marriage might not be the romantic dream of her youth, but perhaps it could be something better, a genuine partnership built on honesty, respect, and the slow-growing trust between two people who had both learned that life rarely followed the expected script. The months that followed brought transformation in ways both expected and surprising. Maribel threw herself into estate management with an enthusiasm that startled even her. The neglected gardens were restored, the house refreshed with new draperies and repaired plasterwork. The tenant cottages improved with her portion of her income. She established schools for the estate workers' children, expanded the home farm's dairy operations, and somehow found time to serve on 3 charitable boards in London. She was busy in a way she had never been before, her days filled with meaningful work that exhausted and fulfilled her simultaneously. And through it all, Theobald was present, not hovering or interfering but available. He attended her committee meetings when his schedule allowed, discussed estate decisions over breakfast, and gradually drew her into his political work until she became an informal advisor on social policy matters. They developed routines, morning tea taken together in the small parlour, evening walks through the grounds when weather permitted, quiet hours in the library, where they read in companionable silence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, friendship deepened into something that felt remarkably like partnership, and partnership into something that might have been the early stages of genuine affection. 6 months after their wedding, Maribel found herself in the gardens at twilight, examining the new roses she had planted. They were thriving, their blooms full and fragrant in the summer air. She was so absorbed in her inspection that she didn't hear Theobald approach until he spoke. Beautiful. But when she looked up, his gaze was on her rather than the flowers. "The gardener deserves the credit," she said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I merely suggested the varieties. I wasn't talking about the roses." He moved closer, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Maribel, these past months with you have been unexpected. I proposed a business arrangement, and somehow found myself married to someone I genuinely admire, respect, care for." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. They had maintained their careful distance, their separate chambers, their agreement that theirs would be a partnership of convenience rather than romance. But somewhere along the way, convenience had transformed into something deeper, and both of them knew it. "I care for you as well," she said quietly. "More than I expected to. More than I thought myself still capable of feeling." Then perhaps, he reached out, his hand finding hers among the roses. "Perhaps we might renegotiate the terms of our arrangement. Not a marriage of convenience, but something more. If you would be willing." Looking up at him in the fading light, seeing the tentative hope in his expression, Maribel realized that the practical consideration she had agreed to had become something precious. This reserved man who had rescued her from humiliation had given her so much more than status and security. He had given her purpose, partnership, and now offered something she had thought forever beyond her reach, the possibility of being truly loved, not despite her age or her past, but because of who she was. "I would be very willing," she whispered. When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. This was deep and consuming, the kiss of a man who had held himself in check for months and was finally allowing himself to feel. Maribel melted into his embrace, her arms winding around his neck, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of his touch. They were married already, legally bound and sharing a life. But this felt like the true beginning, not a rescue or a practical arrangement, but a choice made freely by 2 people who had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the most rewarding destinations. Years later, when people asked the Duchess of Northwick about her remarkable marriage, she would smile that serene smile of hers and say simply that she and the Duke had arrived at happiness by an unconventional route. She never spoke of the ball where cruel laughter had driven her to the terrace, or the shocking proposal that had changed her life in a single evening. Those memories were private, treasured pieces of their history together. But sometimes, attending balls with Theobald at her side, she would see a woman sitting alone with the dowagers, wearing dignity like armor against the world's judgment, and she would remember what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to believe that life held nothing more than quiet resignation. On those occasions, she made a point to seek out such women, to engage them in genuine conversation, to remind them with her attention that worth was not determined by marital status or age. It was a small thing, perhaps, But Theobald had taught her that small acts of kindness could change everything. She had been still single at 40 when they mocked her at the Winterbourne ball, but that mockery had led her to the terrace, to Theobald, to a life richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. The cruelty of strangers had inadvertently given her the greatest gift she had ever received, a partnership that transformed into love, and a reminder that it was never too late for happiness to find you, even in the most unexpected ways. Dear listeners, we hope you enjoyed this journey with Maribel and Theobald, discovering that love can bloom even in the most unexpected circumstances, and that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Here at Echoes of Romance, we believe every heart deserves its happy ending, no matter the path it takes to get there. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another beautiful story. Leave us a comment telling us what you loved most about Maribel and Theobald's romance. We truly treasure hearing from you. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and activate those notifications so you'll be the first to know when we share our next captivating historical romance. Thank you for spending this time with us, and remember, your own beautiful story is still being written, no matter what chapter you're currently living. Until next time, dear friends, keep believing in the magic of love.